Welcome to HR Studio Podcast. Through bi-weekly interviews with HR executives, thought leaders, authors, speakers, and trend spotters from the world of HR and beyond, we invite you to listen, learn, and leverage. Welcome to HR Studio Podcast, building the next generation of HR leaders. HR Studio Podcast is brought to you by A.J. O'Connor Associates, a trusted human capital consulting partner to emerging, mid-market, and world-class organizations. To learn more, visit us at ajoconnor.com.
So welcome, everyone. My name is Fred Bunsa, and I'm your host for this week's HR Studio Podcast interview. This week, we're welcoming back Dick Richardson. Dick's an executive leadership development consultant. He's also the owner and the founding partner of Experience to Lead, an organization that offers unique experiences to improve the leadership of individuals, teams, and organizations. Dick has worked with the Conference Board for over 10 years, designing and delivering experiential programs for executives. Prior to doing that work, Dick was an independent consultant. He was executive director of leadership development at ITT, and he also held a variety of leadership positions at Learning at IBM, including global roles based in Hong Kong and a number of other overseas assignments. He's recently written a book called Apollo Leadership Lessons, and that's the result of his work in the Apollo Leadership Experience program that he developed, where he partnered with NASA, the Smithsonian Institute, the Space Center at Houston, and the Kennedy Space Center to pull together an amazing array of resources for leadership development. So Dick, welcome back to HR Studio Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So normally, Dick, when I have an author on, one of my very first questions is, why this book? Why now? I think I have a suspicion that given that the 50th anniversary of the Apollo landing on the moon, Apollo 11, is going to be in July, that's why now, right?
Yes.
And so what caused you to see even the Apollo space mission as a place that had rich leadership lessons, and which of course led to the program and your book?
Yeah, we have run a number of experiential learning programs looking at the Olympics, looking at different battlefields, Normandy, Gettysburg, and so on. But the unique thing about NASA is that it was a 10-year mission in the 60s to get to the moon. And that sort of long-term view and all of the opportunities and challenges and good things and bad things that happen are more like what business leaders face today. You typically aren't faced with a 3-day battle in your world as a business leader. It's a longer-term process. Many projects last many, many years, and so NASA is more parallel to what modern leaders face today. And it's a large, complex organization attempting the impossible, so it's a compelling story.
Interesting. So I want to ask you about a story. The book is filled with a whole bunch of stories and a whole bunch of leadership lessons. I know it's like, picking your favorite child, but do you have a favorite story in there that you'd like to share with us?
Actually, my favorite story would be James Webb, who is the third NASA administrator. The thing I love about James Webb is that he was totally unqualified for the job.
Okay.
He had no background in aerospace at all. He had been in the Bureau of the Budget in the federal government and so on. But the beauty of that is that he was aware of that. And so he looked at himself with a very critical eye and said, what do I need to learn? How do I need to change? And how do I need to innovate within the organization in order to be successful? And so I won't get into the specifics, but it's in the book. He did a number of unique organizational design ideas to play to his strengths and to compensate for his personal weaknesses and to make the organization stronger through organizational design. He did that by a firm understanding of himself, knowing himself as a leader and as a person, his strengths and the areas he needed some help.
Wow. And how long did he serve in that role?
He was in the role of the NASA administrator for 7 years. If you look at who really put America on the moon, It's him and his executive team. I mean, the astronauts are sort of the stars of the story. We all admire them because they risked their lives for this exploration. But that executive team over 7 years are really the people who put America up there.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And tell me about the vision that's required to do that. I mean, it's, Kennedy gets the credit for setting that vision, but you make a point in the book that setting vision is critical, but it's not enough. So say a little bit about that.
Yeah, many leaders, we tend to do this even on an annual basis. And that is, we have the kickoff meeting in January or February, and we say, these are the objectives, this is my vision. And we've worked on it for a couple months, and we've got the beautiful PowerPoint slides, and now we're done. We're good. And in fact, that's not the way the world works. There's a number of human biases that come into play here that are working against us. The first one is our own bias, and that is leaders tend to have an optimistic bias that once I say something, once I convey something, once I write that email and send it out, everyone will understand and obviously get in line and buy into the new vision or the direction or the change. In fact, we're overestimating our own influence. On the participant side, or the employees and the workers and the other managers that report to us, we have a number of biases that are working against us. One is confirmation bias, and that is we're looking to say, does this change or this vision match with what is already going on in my world, to what I already know? And oftentimes, by the very nature of change, it doesn't. So if you look at Kennedy, he's saying we're going to go to the moon. At that time, the United States had 15 minutes of experience in space. He had no right putting that kind of vision out there. So it didn't match with what we knew. Some people thought this was actually a very bad idea because it was so outlandish. The other thing that we battle against is recency bias, and that is people will remember, recall, and work upon those things that are most recently happened. And so if we just have that statement of that new vision, of that change in January or February, and we have one follow-up note, that will quickly fade from our memories. What we need to do as leaders is continually go out and bring that back to the forefront, make it the most recent thing. And if you look at Kennedy, he did a beautiful job of this. He first made the vision and spoke to Congress in 61. And then if you look at the famous Rice speech, that's 14 months later. He's still nurturing and renewing that vision, moving around the country, talking to groups, trying to influence and overcome recency bias.
So there was not a wholesale shift in resources and in desire even to get behind the space program. It was a continual selling and influencing effort.
Exactly. It was continual selling and getting different constituencies to see how this fit with their view of the world, what the benefits were, and getting that buy-in.
Yeah, I mean, so many parallels there between that and the various initiatives that our podcast listeners and leaders in general have to put the vision out there and keep revisiting it and keep managing the stakeholders, it sounds like.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. One of the things you talk about in the book, which sounds like a NASA term, but it has leadership implications, is perceptual fraction. Can you talk about what that is and how it plays out in our own kind of corporate life and leadership?
Yeah, perceptual fraction is basically the compared to what question. The example I sometimes give is if I offered you, Fred, $1,000 radio, it's a very good radio. And if I said, I'll sell it to you for $1,000, you would probably say no, because it's $1,000 compared with not spending the $1,000. So the perceptual fraction is 1,000 over zero. So that's not a very favorable one. If, however, let's say you were buying a very nice car, beautiful new Mercedes, and I was the car salesman, and I changed the fraction on you. And let's say you're spending, I don't know, $60,000 on this beautiful car. And then I say, oh, but it doesn't have a radio. So I'll put a radio in it for $1,000. Now the ratio is 1,000 to 60,000. And you say, well, geez, I'm already spending 60,000. What's another 1,000? I'll take it.
No, Dick, I never say what's another 1,000. But I get your point.
But the idea is it's the compared to what, if you look at Kennedy when he would talk about the space program, he would use perceptual fractions a lot to influence people. So when you look at it, he was asking the country to spend over $20 billion at that time. And
20 billion?
20 billion. So people were like, there's so many other things we could spend this on. So 20 billion compared with zero. But what he did was he said, what I'm asking for is the same amount as what this country spends on cigars and cigarettes every day. And so all of a sudden the comparison is, would you rather go to the moon or would you rather have a cigar? And I mean, it's really obvious what the country wants to do then.
Interesting. And so how would you, I imagine in your programs, you talk about those stories and then you have conversations around how leaders can use some of those same influencing techniques today. So what would be a way that like our podcast listeners could use something like perceptual fraction when they're pitching their ideas around leadership development or around a change within the business?
So one of the things I personally try to do in leading change, and I've seen done very effectively by people I've learned from, and that is using the perceptual fraction in relation to an organizational change. When you announce a reorg or an acquisition or a merger or any of those kinds of big changes, it seems like they fill the room. But if you say, actually, let's look at all the things that are not changing. We're still working at the same company. Your salary is not going to change. The person you report to is not going to change. All of the accoutrements around your job, your office is not going to change, your colleagues. And so then all of a sudden the fraction is, well, the organizational structure is going to change, but my daily life is not. So the fraction is a very favorable one to say, I can accept this because it's not nearly as great a change as I thought it was when I first heard it.
Interesting. So taking the recency of the effect that you just mentioned earlier about this big change coming and then putting it into perspective compared to actually my day-to-day is remaining largely unchanged for now, can help me deal and sort of buy into the bigger change more easily.
Exactly.
Okay, awesome. What about, there's some, you make some comments in the book about organizations oftentimes don't do a great job or they even forget about lessons learned as they move into new moments in their organization. Talk a little bit about that. I don't know how you saw that play out at NASA and what the leadership implications are.
Yeah, I think there is a thing that happens in organizations, and NASA is a great example. If you look at the three great tragedies of manned spaceflight in the United States, it's the Apollo 1 fire where 3 astronauts died, the Challenger that Krista McCullough was on that blew up at launch, and then Columbia that came apart in reentry. And so those are the 3 times where we've had fatalities in the manned space program. If you start to look at those, it's very interesting that they are all almost exactly 20 years apart. And if you were to ask an actuarial, what is a generation? They will tell you it's 20 years. So what you have is we learned the lessons of Apollo 1 and we fixed the organizational problems and we put in leadership practices and approaches that make it safe in this case for astronauts to go into space, or at least safer. But after a generation, those leaders are gone, those processes start to become outdated, and we forget the lessons that are learned, and then we have to learn it again. And so then you look at the lessons learned from Challenger and you look at Columbia, it's the same fundamental causes that made these things happen. So I think there's this natural change and I'm trying to think of the right word to use, that we tend to forget the lessons learned, and that the new generation never experienced the joy or the heartache of what that happened in the past.
Yeah. And tell us a little bit about what NASA did to embed some of those values within the organization.
what they do is they remind people all the time. The one way you see it is NASA is a big user of symbolism in their culture. So they have mission patches for everything. Every mission has its own patch that's designed specifically for that by the people who fly it. And so the mission patches are everywhere, and people are very proud of the missions that they've been a part of. And so the successful missions, there's actually a ceremony to hang those plaques on the wall and so on. But if you look at the most prominent patches in any of the buildings at, say, Johnson Space Center, it's not the successes. Those patches, for instance, if I go to the neutral buoyancy lab where astronauts train for spacewalks, the patches of their successes are 16 inches tall. If you look at, they also have the 3 patches of the failed missions, Apollo 1, Challenger, and Columbia. Those patches hang on the opposite wall, and they are 9 feet tall.
Wow.
So if you look at if you go into that building, the thing that catches your eye are, this is where we forgot our values, and this is where we screwed up. And so that's a very powerful message. Most companies, most schools, they always put their wins in the trophy case. NASA is very good at saying, remember when we failed, and we can never let that happen again.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, for NASA to fail has serious human consequences, as well as scientific ones. So the missions are near and dear. Do you ever get leaders who are going through this and they ask you about, Dick, how do we make our missions more important? I mean, we're always on to the next one, and we don't really take any time. Have you explored how companies can be better at celebrating the wins and the losses?
Well, I think one of the things that we can learn from NASA is NASA debriefs everything, and they celebrate every win, but they also go over every failure or every close to failure, even if it didn't fail, but we came close. And so I think they are very good at pausing themselves and considering and reflecting. And I think in modern business, we are just rush, move on to the next thing. And so we don't take that moment to pause and say, how did that go? What did we do right? What can we learn from it? I think there's also a mistake that we make in business. And the label of it is called superstitious learning. And that is, we tend to look at when things went wrong and focus mostly on those. And we don't look as carefully at our successes and to figure out why we succeeded. So we get a biased view of learning from our experience. And so I think if you make it more routine and you look at your successes as much as you look at your failures, you have continuous learning, but it's also more balanced learning.
Oh, interesting. That's good advice. I mean, a lot of our audience is involved in leadership development and learning as well. So those are really good lessons to keep in mind. I'm going to ask you for some advice for our audience, but before I do, I can't help but notice there's an astronaut right behind you. It looks like up behind your right shoulder. So for those of you watching this video, Dick has who's that, a life-size cutout of someone behind you? Who is that, and why does he stare at you all day long?
That is Tim Kopra, and Tim is a friend of mine. And some people love flown objects, and that is an object that has actually gone into outer space. And so Tim Kopra is an NASA astronaut who did me a great favor, and he took a pin of mine, a lapel pin, and he took it up on the International Space Station, and it was up there for 7 months. It has 78 million miles on it. And so then he brought it back. It actually came back on a Russian Soyuz vehicle, and it ended up coming back to me. And I have a certificate that Tim gave it to me. But then they had NASA had a life-size poster to honor Tim. And then after the event, I asked them what was going to happen to the poster, and they said, "Oh, I guess we'll just throw it away." I said, "Is there any way I could take it home?" So I have Tim Kopra forever in my office.
Great. Well, as we wrap up this episode of HR Studio Podcast, Dick, any advice from the book, from life, from NASA, any advice you'd have for our audience of rising HR leaders?
I think that the advice I would give is, and it's the purpose of the book, and that is we can learn from the successes and failures of others. So in this case, we're looking at the successes and failures of NASA. But I try to do that all the time. I look at why did the local restaurant succeed or why did it fail? I look at every business I touch and every organization, and I say, what are they doing that's good and right? And what are the things that are doing that can predict that they're going to fail? So I would not be myopic. I would look at every other business, even if it doesn't seem like it's relevant. If you look at Hershey chocolate, they're doing things right. And if you look at Vulcan Materials, it's pulling rock out of the ground, they're doing things right and wrong. We can learn from all of those and learn from each other.
That's great. Great. Well, Dick, thank you so much for joining us today. Dick has been kind enough to offer one free copy of his book, Apollo Leadership Lessons, to one of our random subscribers. So if you're not already a subscriber to HR Studio Podcast, we'd encourage you to go to hrstudiopodcast.com and sign up. There you'll find show notes for today. You'll find a link to Dick's book. And one lucky subscriber will win a copy of the book. So, Dick, thank you so much for offering that to us. And we are really thrilled to have you back on the podcast. Good luck with your leadership journey.
Thank you very much.
Welcome to HR Studio Podcast. Through bi-weekly interviews with HR executives, thought leaders, authors, speakers, and trend spotters from the world of HR and beyond, we invite you to listen, learn, and leverage. Welcome to HR Studio Podcast, building the next generation of HR leaders. HR Studio Podcast is brought to you by A.J. O'Connor Associates, a trusted human capital consulting partner to emerging, mid-market, and world-class organizations. To learn more, visit us at ajoconnor.com.